Hi, I'm Robert Tyler. I am president of Advocates for Faith and Freedom, and I'm also a managing partner with Tyler and Bursch. I'm actually would like to say that maybe Jen is starting to manage more than I am. So Jen is my partner at Tyler and Bursch, and she's does a lot of work in regard to human resources and employment law. And we have this presentation for this seminar called Ministry Under Fire. We started this last year up with Gateway Seminary, and because of COVID-19, there's a prohibition on gatherings, and so we're now bringing this to you live via YouTube and I believe Facebook. And if you have the opportunity to share it, we appreciate it. Last week, we did a presentation on the orders regarding COVID-19 as it applies to churches and schools in California. We talked about the litigation we're involved in. We talked about the legal issues, the strategies, and it was, I think, very informative. And you can go back to our YouTube channel and go ahead and pull that up, and you'll be able to see what we talked about. And then we're going to have 2 more weeks, Wednesdays at 10 a.m., where we're going to be addressing some additional topics as it really pertains to ministries. And come back and keep an eye on our Facebook. Jen, what's the subject next week?
Next week is unemployment and FMLA and all the changes that have occurred with COVID and over the last couple months with the new laws that have come out. Just kind of updating everybody on what they need to know on those topics.
So unemployment with all of the issues with funding and who qualifies, who doesn't. And then FMLA, for those who don't know what the acronym stands for.
Family Medical Leave Act.
Okay, so there's obviously people get sick with COVID-19. So for the ministries, we have a unique ability to be able to address things from the perspective of ministries and 501c3s and on how those apply. So we'll be talking about that. September 30th, Wednesday at 10 a.m., we'll be talking about the pros and cons of state and federal funds for private schools. Should private schools accept funds from the feds? For example, the funds that were provided through the CARES Act. You know, there's a lot of conversation whether that was a good thing or bad thing. There's talk about another stimulus package, and is that going to be something that schools or even churches should be taking up? So I think that one, even though we're talking about schools in terms of funding, it could apply to a lot of churches as well who have other ministries such as homeless shelters or various outreaches that it could cross over there as well.
Well, and even for the churches, there are churches that have gotten some of the funding that has come out. And I believe with this next stimulus, it's possible that they could apply for some of that as well. So right now we're looking at, I am going to try to put together a presentation that talks about both to some extent. It'll focus on schools, but definitely cover some of the church issues as well.
Okay, so that's September 30th. So the next 2 Wednesdays. So we ask you to, please register. You can register on or register at faith-freedom.com/events. And again, these will be up on our YouTube channel. You'll be able to go back and subscribe and view these at your convenience as well. Share them with your staff. Use them as you wish, frankly. Okay. And then everyone who registered for this event on our website, we have 85 to 100, I guess, who've registered. What we'll be doing is we'll be sending you the sample forms and releases that we're going to be talking about today that you'll be able to use with your employees, parents, congregants. But we ask you, make sure you listen to what we're talking about rather than just waiting and receiving the documents and then just using them, because you may use them improperly, or maybe you might use them and not even necessary in your circumstance. So if you have not registered or do not receive our email with forms by the end of the day, please email us at info@tylerbursch.com, info@tylerbursch.com. or info@faith-freedom.com. Either one. Just so you know, our relationship between our Advocates for Faith and Freedom and Tyler and Bursch is that Jen and I started Advocates for Faith and Freedom and the law firm Tyler and Bursch, the private firm, back in 2005. And back then, we had the goal of really representing churches and ministries to be able to serve your needs from both the business perspective, to be able to handle your corporate needs, your various employment issues, et cetera, real estate issues, be able to just serve as general counsel for churches and ministries and Christian schools. And then at the same time, we have this ministry called Advocates for Faith and Freedom. And Advocates for Faith and Freedom is a nonprofit where we take on religious liberty cases pertaining to churches, schools, individuals, defending our First Amendment right to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, right now, we're extremely busy in that arena. And again, listen to last week's YouTube and you'll get more on that. Let's jump to our presentation. Jen titled it Holes, Reopening Guidelines. And so let's jump to that, Jen. And I think that this is something that we get so many questions about how, as a church or as a school, what should we be doing? How should we be reopening? Should we be using infrared technology? Should we not open at all? Should we ignore the guidance from the state? Should we stand on our First Amendment liberties? This has just been chaos in California. And so hopefully what we talk about today will help to eliminate a little bit of the chaos. So there are holes that you talked about. Why don't you explain what you mean by holes?
Well, I titled it that because there are so many holes even in the reopening guidelines. As you look to reopen, all the churches and the schools that we're talking to are seeing these holes in the guidelines as far as how they apply in their specific situation, and where they cross over. You'll see on a later slide, if your church or your school, there's all these different guidelines that apply to you. And there's holes in between the guidelines, there's holes in the guidelines, and it's just very difficult to navigate it. And that's, we've spent a good portion in the last couple months just trying to help ministries navigate those holes, navigate reopening, navigate all the guidelines and how they interconnect with each other. And when they, we get questions all the time. Actually, one of the questions that was submitted today are the guidelines requirements or are they guidelines? The government's saying they're requirements. Obviously, they call them guidelines. And some of the guidelines you can see, and this is where I think more holes come in. They say we suggest that you consider, where in other areas of the guidelines it says you must. And even that is difficult for ministries to figure out.
Yeah, especially in the beginning, when the guidelines first came out, there was this big question: Are these legal orders or are they not? Do they have the effect of law or do they not? And I think that Governor Newsom and his team were pretty strategic in trying to avoid making it appear as though it's a law, although it is. And they did what they could to try to give themselves some leverage to be able to make legal arguments when they got sued.
Well, and it is interesting to have a law that says things like you should consider doing the following. That's not really a law in and of itself. I mean, it doesn't require that they do some of the things in the guidelines. Some of them are still suggestions because of how it's phrased in the guidelines. And that's where it gets complicated for ministries when they're trying to figure out how to develop these policies and what to do. And you're sitting at something that says, consider disinfecting frequently. Well, what does that mean for them? How often do they have to do it? Where does liability potentially come in? Still things we're all figuring out because this is new for everybody.
One of the other things, I have not talked to you about this yet, is Senator Shannon Grove sent to us. I was on a panel a couple nights ago with Church United and a Hispanic ministry as well. And the ministry is titled the name Urgent Ministerial Organization is, I forget exactly the title, but it was, they're recognizing how urgent things are. But one of the things that Shannon Grove provided in that meeting and gave it to us, I had an opportunity to read a rough draft of a proposed order that is going to be coming out on social gathering. So there's been this big question about, okay, how are we going to deal with Bible studies? How do you deal with gatherings in someone's home where, you have a couple families come together and all of a sudden they decide, hey, let's sing some worship. And does that suddenly turn into a worship service? And so there's also this guideline that's supposed to apply to basically all social gatherings, and it's going to limit social gatherings to no more than 3 family units coming together. Anything else is illegal. Craziness that we live in.
Well, and that's what I was talking about, the holes, is that I've seen that. I saw the draft of it. I can't remember where I saw it, but you see that and you kind of juxtapose that with the guidelines on, for instance, places of worship. At what point is it a church and a religious service? Because remember, that guideline is entitled places of worship and I think religious services. Yeah. Okay, so is a Bible study in someone's backyard a religious service? That they're all meeting to do a Bible study, it's, sanctioned by a church, or even if it's not, at what point does that cross over to just a gathering? Because a religious service can be outside, right? We know that we can be outside and we can even sing outside as long as we're socially distanced and, follow the mask rules and all that. And that's where I would argue, even that is hard. To me, that's a whole, or it's just hard to figure out what guidelines am I following in this instance. Am I supposed to be doing places of worship and religious services because we're doing a Bible study and that's what follows? Or is that a gathering? Or are those gatherings social gatherings where it just gets so complicated?
And this is one of the reasons why, we have, we're bringing these lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of these orders, because we don't think many of these orders are constitutional. We are challenging the governor's authority under the Emergency Services Act. That, we're arguing that act in and of itself is unconstitutional. We're arguing the violation of the free exercise of religion. We've had some difficulty in the courts. Actually, there's only about 3 of us in California, 3 organizations that are really taking on these battles. We're teaming up with them. We're working with each other a lot. It's very difficult to succeed. And so we're bringing this presentation at the same time while we're challenging all these other guidelines. Why is it important for us to tell people how to comply with the guidelines?
Well, because I think everybody has different convictions, and we want to, it's my goal at least, to help all the churches and the schools and the ministries who feel like they are going to comply with the guidelines. We're also supporting and helping ministries who aren't. And I think that it's legitimate to be coming from different places and in different places. This is such a unique time. And I've talked to pastors on all, and I know you have too, on all different places in that, coming from that, and pastors that have moved where they are at as time has gone on. To be honest, I've moved how I feel about it personally, but as an attorney, I feel like it's important to support our clients, and that's what these guidelines are relevant to the clients. And we want to talk through what you can do if you want to comply. And most pastors I talk to at this point are complying where they can and where they feel like it doesn't really impair their ministry, and then not when they feel convicted that it is impairing their ministry. Yeah. So I think walking through them and at least being able to explain to everybody when they apply, what guidelines are relevant, so that they can walk through that is important.
Many of the churches and schools that we represent who are saying we just simply are not going to comply with these orders. We are going to hold in-person classes at school. We are going to hold in-person indoor worship. Some of them are saying we're going to do indoor worship, and we're not going to socially distance, and we're not going to force people to wear masks. There are different convictions, as you said, but I think that across the board, from so many of those pastors, what they've said to us, look, this is our conviction. I'm not going to force my conviction on other churches. You might have some churches or schools where maybe they have a unique situation where it's an elderly congregation, for example, and they're like, if we are going to meet, we are going to follow all the guidelines because those people are at risk. And then you might have some younger churches. And so we're here really wanting to give this presentation to say, okay, if you decide as a ministry you're going to you want to comply, or at least you want to know what the rules are.
Or at least comply with some of them.
Yeah.
And that's where there's just such a wide spectrum from I'm going to open, this is my conviction, to I'm going to comply with all of them, to most ministries I know of are falling somewhere in the middle of that.
And we want to talk about the risks as well. Mm-hmm. We want to talk about the risks associated with not complying, right? Okay, so your first slide, why don't you summarize that?
So the next one is just finding the holes in the guideline, one guideline at a time, meaning realizing that there's all these different guidelines, and even realizing that the guidelines change. I've had ministries that I'm advising. It's been crazy as an attorney. You're telling the ministry to do one thing, and literally you look at the guideline the next day and there was a change. And it's not like they're announcing that there's a change. Yeah. It just suddenly changes in the guideline, and it's like, oh, okay. So really this one is just addressing that there's separate guidelines for schools, churches, offices, gatherings that really can interplay with each other in odd ways sometimes. We talk about it being easy to miss the target on the guidelines because the guidelines change and there's new tiers that come out and there's new standards. And so not only are the guidelines changing, but even what we're required to do by the government, it's just a constant flux. So just reminding everybody to kind of keep taking a look at it and keep just conversing about it. And, at the beginning, I think there was a lot of stress of, oh my gosh, the guidelines changed. To me, you look at it once a week and you figure it out. And then just a reminder that as far as timelines and when the guidelines apply in the tiers, to look at your county numbers, those are available on the state and county websites to get an idea of where your county falls, because we're talking to pastors and ministries today all over California. Yeah. And some of them are in different situations. Some of them are in the red tier, which is opened up a little bit more, and you could have indoor services if you up to 125% capacity if you're a church and a place of worship. Some of them, and we are located, our main office, in a purple tier, which is, you're still stuck outside. So,
do you recall, off the top of your head, I believe San Diego and Orange County are now in the lower tier.
They're in red. Yeah.
So they're able to begin having indoor worship services.
They are. They're at 100. They're at 100 or 25% capacity, whichever one is lower.
100 persons or 25% capacity.
Yep.
Oh boy. Again, that's one of those things where we would look at and we would say, come on, that's got to be unconstitutional. How can a casino have different guidelines than a church?
Sure.
But unfortunately, Chief Justice Roberts threw out the case from Nevada on that already. So, if you're in a red tier, you're able to reopen. Be thankful you're able to reopen.
Yeah.
But there are these guidelines, and unfortunately, we're somewhat stuck with them at this point in time. Let's jump to the next slide, Jen.
So the next slide is reopening for churches. I went through the guidelines again over the weekend as I was preparing for this, and just wrote down the 4 that really seemed like they were the most applicable to churches at this point, which are places of worship, the office guidelines, gatherings, which is up on the website. That is actually when I saw that. And then workplace outbreak guidance for employers. So we get a ton of questions, that last one, about what happens if someone tests positive for COVID. What are we responsible to do? What's our next step? And they have come out with, for workplaces, an outbreak guidance if somebody tests positive, and some charts and some different things to indicate how long people should be out for, when you test, when, how you communicate.
Can we go to the first one?
Sure.
One, places of worship, applicable guidelines. Why don't you summarize those guidelines in broad detail?
Well, that really depends on the county, and that's where on the right side it says other considerations. What color tier is your county? That's the first one there, because the guidelines for worship generally talk about cleaning, making sure that you're disinfecting, making sure that you're wearing masks if you're indoors, making sure that you're social distancing. That's where you can find the 100-person or 25% guidelines. But depending on your county and how it's interplaying, they're also obviously asking for in the guidelines signage and, notifications to people that if they are feeling sick, if they have any COVID symptoms, that they're not coming in or not attending worship. So it just kind of walks through all those very broadly from a broad perspective. But what guidelines apply and when, again, goes back to the color of the tier of your county.
Okay, so looking at the most restrictive tier, the top tier, that tier is the tier that says churches can only meet outdoors. Mm-hmm. So if you're in that county, you're only allowed to meet outdoors. Mm-hmm. When you do meet outdoors, you still have to wear masks. You still have to do social distancing. Masks are required, especially anytime you're singing, they say. And then there's in some counties, there's limitations on how many people can attend. For example, in Santa Clara County, one of our lawsuits, there's a limitation on how many people can attend an outdoor service. But I think most counties, they don't have a limit on how many people can attend the outdoor service, right?
Yeah, that I know of. I think it's only in Santa Clara. But it's another good point. And that's where we're talking about holes in the reopening guidelines. Mm-hmm. Even for us, every county is different. It's just difficult you got to look at every single county. And I would encourage ministries, if you're listening and you have any specific questions about your county or specifics about the guidelines, that you just give us a call and we can walk through those things with you.
Okay. And then in regard to indoor, we talked about that. Most of the biggest and most significant limitation is the number of people who can attend indoors. And then there's the social distancing guidelines, and especially if you're indoors, they require signage. Just like a lot of the businesses, this stay 6 feet apart and the stuff that I'm sorry, I cannot stand seeing those signs. But you know what? We even have them in our office because a lot of people come from different perspectives. I don't want to get sued by someone who comes into my office and says, I got sick, I blame it on you, and you didn't have signs up. Had I seen the sign, I would have been safe. So we'll be talking about some of the documentation like that, the waivers later, I think, right?
Yeah, we have samples of some of those that we can send out to people, and we go through that at the bottom there.
Okay, so let me look here. So reopening applicable guidelines, the office is a bit different. For churches, there's different guidelines.
Well, really, it's just the office guidelines for everybody, but that really focuses more on making sure you're training your employees and what you need to do with your employees and making sure that sitting areas in offices are socially distant and that you're disinfecting frequently throughout the day. Obviously, mask wearing is important there. It even talks about remote work if you can remote work. So yeah, those guidelines are separate. And we do have a return to work toolkit that goes through all the policies that are relevant for offices that we've prepared if anybody needs any of that. It actually has all the policies, the forms, and goes through an entire checklist of things to consider as you're opening your office.
So the guidelines for church offices and Christian schools or private schools, those are different than actually the worship setting inside a sanctuary.
Correct, yeah.
And then gatherings. We talked a little bit about gatherings already, and there was this, and there's still an open hole. I don't think, we mentioned earlier about these draft guidelines that Senator Shannon Grove put out, but I don't think they've been.
I found them on the website for guidelines, so I believe that they're up.
Oh, they're already up. Okay.
Yeah.
So there are now guidelines for what they call social gatherings, and that means that any ministries that you have for Bible studies, anything outside the walls of the church, even if they're inside the walls of the church, Celebrate Recovery, things, for those who don't know what Celebrate Recovery, sort of drug, rehab, addiction, group therapy, those kinds of things. Those are all different those would probably come under the social gatherings and definitely not under the worship.
See, and I would
services.
argue that they don't, and here's why. Because there's an entire another set of guidelines for mental health and for providing social services.
Yeah.
So, and that's, you could argue it at least, and that's where there's all these gray areas that I think reasonable people can differ as to where it falls.
Yeah.
What if a church isn't in the four walls of a church and they meet in someone's backyard? I think that falls under places of worship. What about a Bible study? Why can't a Bible study fall under a religious service, which is under places of worship? And then Celebrate Recovery or Fresh Hope or any of those counseling, we get a lot of counseling questions. I think that those fall under mental health, and they're specific. Those are considered to be essential. So they've been, there's so many different things there. And that's why we're talking about holes, right? There's so many different areas.
What about, I was talking to a pastor this weekend, and he was just sharing how they have a book club, and it's a book club. It's not a study of the Bible. It's not a worship service. They just get together. They talk about some Christian book and, what they gained from it and that sort of thing. It's, a spiritual awakening, Christ-based type thing. But what does that fall under? I think that would fall under a social gathering, probably.
I would guess so, yeah.
Yeah. So it's hard because there's these different guidelines, and we're here. We're here as a law firm. Call us. We can help you. We serve as general counsel to a lot of ministries, and I'll throw that out there. We do this. We have a nonprofit arm of what we do, and that is to take cases on to promote the First Amendment, right to religious liberty. And there's other cases, and on our private law firm, we specialize in just representing churches and answering generic legal questions on things like this. And, if you guys are in need of a Christ-centered law firm that you need to be able to call on for questions, that's us. Let's look at the last one, number 4, workplace outbreak guidance for employers. Yeah. Okay. So someone gets sick.
Yeah.
Someone comes down with COVID-19 in your office or at your. Let's go with whether it be a church school or a church or a school, and the church secretary comes down with COVID-19.
Yeah.
What do you do?
And that's where this guidance walks through that. I mean, what you do is obviously you send them home. It's supposed to be 10 days from a positive test. There's all these different 14, 10 days based on all these different scenarios. And this guideline is actually helpful in walking through that. Obviously, you communicate to your staff or anybody who was exposed or came into contact. They call close contact as 15 minutes within 6 feet. So that's where it really helps. And, some of these guidelines, I have so many ministries that are frustrated by them. And yet I've had ministries that have had a COVID positive test and it hasn't spread anywhere in the office because they are abiding by the social distancing and the different things. And as frustrating as those can be, when that happened and nobody else went out and they were able to keep operating, that's obviously a good thing. So it kind of walks through. It has a chart for if you were exposed, if you're positive, if you've had symptoms, how many days they should be out of the office and what that looks like. Schools obviously have somewhat different standards. That it's slightly different in the school guidelines because
we're talking about if it's within the student population, teacher population, or are we talking about within the office?
So even for the office of a school, I think that goes with the school guidelines because the school guidelines say over 5% of anybody at the school, staff, faculty, students, means that the entire school needs to be out for 2 weeks. So it's there. I'm not saying a lot of them cross over, and I still think the workplace outbreak guidance is helpful in so far as some of the charts and the timeframes, but schools need to be careful, even with office staff, that they're really looking at the school guidance because it addresses that specifically.
Okay. So one of the things I just kind of noted, we're talking about guidelines. We keep referencing guidelines. Nowhere have we said where you get those guidelines. The guidelines we're talking about, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, you say guidelines. Yeah, what in the world is that? it's almost like we're sitting here assuming everybody knows. I think most people do know. It's kind of common sense for anybody who's really involved. So forgive me, actually, that's probably not wrong, because if you don't know what I'm talking about, I'm not saying you don't have common sense. But what I am saying is that there is guidelines on the state website.
Yeah,
for
we
COVID-19.
actually have that later on.
Okay.
On one of the slides, we actually have one of the locations for those that we can walk through.
So we'll get to that. You'll be able to see where you find these guidelines, but they're also real easy. You Google California state guidelines for COVID-19 and they pop up. And these are guidelines that are put out by the state public health officer. And I think it's the state Department of Public Health. And they have a section at COVID-19 and they have guidelines. And that's where you go to find what we're talking about when we're referencing guidelines. Okay, there's some other considerations we talked about. We already talked about how counties, different counties are in different tiers. Let's talk about when does insurance come into play? And that's a big issue. You know, churches are saying, am I insured? What happens? So let's start off with the church that is the church or school who is in compliance. All right. They're saying, okay, I'm going to comply with the orders. If it's a school, I'm in the top tier. We're just doing online learning. Mm-hmm. They're in the lower tier. They're in Orange County. They're in San Diego. They say, okay, we can start doing more. Maybe they have some in-person meetings. Maybe they have, the guidelines for schools do allow, up to 14 kids for special needs and some other things. And maybe they allow some of those. They're doing some of that. And so they're concerned about someone catches COVID-19. Is the insurance going to step in and protect us?
And it depends on your insurance plan. And that's where you have to talk. You're going to have to read your own plan. But we do know of insurance companies that are covering for if someone actually is positive for COVID within the staff and there's business interruption because of that. So I guess I will say at this point, having gone through this last 6 months, I'm aware of policies that will cover for a situation like that. I don't think they all do because I've seen one or two that don't. So I think that's really why I put this on here, to make sure that you're, whether you're reaching out to us and we can look at your policy for you, you're sending it to your broker, you're doing something to kind of address that side of it, because there can be insurance coverage in some of these situations and it could be important.
And there are 3 brokers in particular that we've done a lot of work with that broker for churches. And we've had different conversations with them about what is provided, what will the insurance companies cover and what they won't cover. And it's a bit confusing. Now, there is, for some companies, I believe pretty much for all the companies, if someone catches COVID-19 and they claim that it was because they were at your school or they were at your church service, I believe that pretty much all the insurance companies say, we don't cover pandemics.
Yeah.
There's no coverage for that.
Yeah, and that's where I mentioned business interruption. I don't think there's coverage for someone suing because they caught it there, but there could be coverage for a business interruption losses associated with an employee getting COVID-19. Mm-hmm.
And there's also, for some churches we are involved with, where they've been sued. They've received a cease and desist order. They had a lawsuit brought against them to cease their operations, cease their meetings. And with one insurance company in particular, they've said, we will provide $15,000 of attorney's coverage. Yeah. I'll be honest, that helps us for those cases that we're involved in where we're doing it through our nonprofit. That $15,000 is incredibly helpful for us. It goes a long ways. But those are 2 circumstances or 3 circumstances that we've talked about. There may be some other situations. I'm aware of one insurance company who says, if you're with us and you are operating, even though you're violating the county orders, but you're doing so on the basis of religious liberty, we'll provide you coverage. We'll provide you a defense. I do want to mention also that what's important here as well is we as a law firm taking on so many of these cases, we are regularly appointed by insurance companies to take on these cases or to defend you. So if you have a circumstance where you have a cease and desist order, you're sued, even so far as saying, someone trips and falls on your property, the insurance companies allow us to defend the churches, particularly because we have unique expertise in understanding churches and schools, not just, and even other ministries as well, too, parachurch ministries. Okay, so there's relevant forms and policies that for employees that you referenced here. What are you referencing?
These are just all the forms that we've created. We have some general forms that we're, as Bob mentioned, we'll give at the end of this. They're just sample forms. They're going to have to be modified for your purposes, but it really is just making sure that you have the policies in place to kind of support all of the COVID guidelines. And we have that return to work toolkit for offices. But even if you're talking about generally opening your church as far as the sanctuary and schools, we have some forms that we've created for parents to sign addressing just the waivers, or even acknowledging that they understand that they shouldn't be in school if, for instance, their kid has, as I'm a parent, and prior to COVID-19, if my kid had a, runny nose and a few issues, as a working parent, often you are like, oh, you're okay, go to school, and just kind of acknowledging you can't do that anymore. Now, you just got to be more careful with it. So we have all kinds of employees and forms, or employee forms and forms that we've created for churches who wanted something, for congregants. We have forms for schools that we've created for parents. We have forms even for a physician to sign that we've created for the physician to attest that they can come back to work. Just different things that could be helpful in different settings. Again, they're just samples, and they're not necessarily just to be used without any, you got to make sure that they match your policies, but something to get all these ministries started and further down the road with all that stuff.
Let's go to the next slide, reopening for schools. A lot of these issues we have talked about, the various applicable guidelines. So that we've talked about guidelines, and there's a specific set for schools. We've already talked about that. But there's a guidance for small cohorts. Explain that.
So that's the guidance that came out. It was on August 25th. It just says that schools can have small cohorts of 14 with 2 adults in the room, up to 2 adults, that allow for supervision, special needs, and they have different categories. It's a little crazy. As a lawyer, every time I read it, I think this is nuts that you can have 14 kids being supervised, but not 14 kids being taught. We're obviously fighting that in the courts, but we want schools to know that that's a way to have kids on campus. We have a lot of clients that are doing cohorts that are facilitating distance learning for the older grades where they can't obtain waivers, because the waivers for schools go from K through 6th. So we have schools that have been able to obtain the waivers for K through 6th, and then on 7th through 12th, they're just doing cohorts right now. It's at least helpful in getting kids back on campus. It's not ideal, but it's kind of a middle of the road approach, and those guidelines can be helpful. So just encouraging you to look at that and see how that could fit into an overall plan to get more kids on your campus.
And I'll emphasize that really this small cohort really strikes a nerve for us, because
it does, yeah.
You're sitting here saying, oh, well, you can have this number of students in a classroom with 2 people supervising them, but the minute they teach them how to do arithmetic, it's illegal.
I always use the example of my kid. My kid is in 1st grade, and I take her to back to school night or meet your teacher night, and the school that she attends is a private school at the time. We're in distance learning cohorts. We didn't have a waiver yet. We have one now, so fortunately she's back in school. But when we go to meet your teacher, on the right of the hall is her classroom, her distance learning classroom, and there's a teacher in there that's not actually going to teach her, that's just going to help facilitate distance learning for my 6-year-old. And then literally across the hall is her actual teacher that's going to be speaking into a camera, feeding it to her iPad across the hall.
So great.
And I show her both classrooms and I walk through it. And as we're walking down the hall to leave, my 6-year-old says, "Mommy, I don't understand why I can't just be across the hall with the actual teacher." Honey, I don't understand it either. I don't know why my 6-year-old understands that that's inconsistent and Governor Newsom doesn't, but it is what it is.
Okay.
That's still how it is.
and we're gonna just kind of be a little unvarnished here, even though we're talking about how you can comply with these orders and how you do it. It's so ridiculous because here we are. We know what really is going on. I think we know what is really going on here. It's for the public schools. It's the teachers' unions who have so much influence over Governor Newsom. They do not want to reopen unless they defund the police, they get all this funding. There's all sorts of political reasons behind what's going on that really doesn't have anything to do with COVID-19 in terms of trying to protect kids or protect teachers. It's just astonishing. But here we are. This is, we're in California. We're going to have to deal with it. We're fighting to fight back on those issues in other areas. But let's keep going, and we'll talk about, what do we do to try to help stay in compliance? So all these
other guidelines, we're running out of time. I'm realizing what time it is. But all these other guidelines are most of the ones we've talked about. The school guidance FAQ really just addresses the tier system and the watch list and when schools can open back in person. And then we have guidance on returning to work or school following COVID-19 diagnosis, which is similar to the one we already talked to. And then, of course, the offices, as we talked about with the churches. And then on the other side, for considerations, again, the color of your tier for your county is relevant as to how you can open, whether you can be in person, when the guidelines. Just questioning, can you apply for a waiver? Most counties now, as things have loosened up, you can apply for a waiver.
And that's regardless of, even if you're in the second tier down, you can still apply for a waiver, right?
Well, if you're in purple, which is the top tier, you can apply for a waiver. If you're in red, it'll open up. But even in the purple, if you're super high, you still can't apply for a waiver. There's a limit, an outer limit. But I believe that most counties now you can apply for a waiver, even ones that initially couldn't, I know now are granting them. And they are being granted. I have schools all the time tell me, "Oh, there's no way the state's going to grant them." They are granting them. Everybody should know that. And everybody, really, for K through 6, we're seeing them. We have lots of clients that have gotten them and achieved one. My own daughter is finally back in class with a waiver.
And let me say one thing that as of, I don't know, a week and a half ago, we had taken a look, and out of all the schools that have been granted a waiver, there were some 100 at the time, roughly 100, but they were all private schools. And there was one, I think it was Los Alamitos, one public school that had been granted a waiver.
Yeah.
I find that extremely interesting, that who wants to open up? Well, it's the private schools. Why aren't the public schools submitting their waiver? Because they have the opportunity to do the same, but again, takes us back to this political issue that we're dealing with.
Yeah. And then distance learning cohorts, that's what we were talking about before. That is kind of a workaround. We have a lot of schools that haven't been able to obtain waivers that are using distance learning cohorts to come onto campus. And then the insurance is the same conversation as with the church, really. But schools also should look into their insurance when it can help and just be on top of that as well.
Okay, let's go to the next slide. Identification. How's that?
Identification.
How's that speaking here? Very good, Mr. Lawyer. Identification of COVID outbreaks.
Yeah.
All right. So you referenced Cal OSHA.
Yeah, so this is that one. This is the guidelines we were talking about. All this information comes off those guidelines. I feel like I focused on this guideline because this is the newer guideline that I think this is where I'm getting the most questions right now, is what happens when this happens on my campus now that places are opening up more. So I kind of focused on it. The symptoms, I say symptoms now include because they've taken out symptoms. And again, they don't announce that. And then you look at it and you realize, oh, headaches is gone. I've had lots of ministries and churches say, I have an employee that had a headache. Am I supposed to send them home every time they have a headache? You know, I get headaches quite frequently. I have migraines, and it's like some of these are so they've narrowed the symptoms at least to be a little bit less of kind of your everyday thing. They still can be. My son has allergies, and a lot of this is interesting, but they took headaches off the list. So just kind of identifying what those are. And then on your right side, you have just a real quick breakdown of what the standard, what you're supposed to do. So requirements of reporting employee cases to Cal OSHA, any COVID-19 case that includes inpatient hospitalization and deaths among employees, you have to respond, or you have to report it to Cal OSHA, which I didn't actually even know before reading these guidelines. That's a newer thing. That hasn't happened, fortunately, to any of our clients, so it hasn't been relevant, but it is recommending testing for all employees in the workplace. And when that's not available, trace close contacts of confirmed cases and instruct individuals to quarantine or temporarily close the workplace altogether. Again, close contacts is that becomes such an important concept when you're talking about these types of guidelines. That again is within 6 feet for 15 minutes. So I must repeat that 5 times a day at this point, because people will call and say, oh, I brushed by in the hallway and this person was, and that's according to both the state of California and the CDC, that doesn't qualify. So, and then that's the last one. Close contacts are 15 minutes or more within 6 feet of positive individual. It includes 48 hours before. What that is referencing is that these guidelines say that 48 hours before symptoms, if you were within 6 feet for 15 minutes, that's considered close contact.
Next slide. COVID outbreaks continued. So here you identified a chart can be found here at this website, CDPH, that's California Department of Public Health, and that's where these guidelines are found. So here, what happens with continued outbreaks?
You just maintain the confidentiality and you communicate with other employees that there's been an outbreak. This is another question I get a lot. Confirm that there's a positive, but do not give names or any identifying information of the employee. That's a HIPAA issue. Never want to do that.
And HIPAA is the privacy requirements for medical issues. And you know, as an employer, you cannot just you can't just tell other people what a person's medical condition is. So you've got real limitations there. And this happens especially in schools where, you know, rumor spreads, this person's sick, and you have to be real careful as an employer, because you could find yourself not being sued because someone got COVID-19, but being sued because you violated an employee's right to privacy.
Right. And that's where just reminding people of that, notify those that are potentially exposed. And then there's a chart, and that's the chart that I referenced, when cases and contacts of cases can return to work. So it walks through that. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And then work areas of an affected individual should be disinfected before anybody goes into those areas. So that's kind of a quick walk through what that looks like.
Next slide, we talk about waivers and disclaimers. And let's talk about employees, volunteers. Big question is, how effective are waivers and disclaimers? And I'll throw out the first comment that really, you know, they're not foolproof. It's not as though you throw out a waiver, you throw out a disclaimer, you have an employee sign a document, you have a church congregant come sign a document. It's not as though that somehow that is just automatically going to be effective.
True. And we tell ministries that all the time. I still feel like on my end that they're important because they can argue against negligence because you're at least doing everything that you can. And honestly, some of it is just a good reminder for some of the documents that we've created. For instance, just say, hey, these are the symptoms, and if you have those symptoms, please don't come, or please come a different time, or please don't bring your kid to school. And just having them acknowledge that they've read that, because again, people really come from such wildly different views on COVID and how dangerous it is and what should be happening. So these waivers and disclaimers, and that's with employees, it says Make sure you've done training, and after you do the training, you have forms signed. Make sure you're engaging in open dialogue with your employees. I think that's incredibly important right now. Things are changing and things are so different that it's important to make sure that you're engaging in that dialogue and that you've opened that dialogue with your employees. That, as far as cutting down on lawsuits and issues within the work setting, I feel like that's almost as important as a waiver and disclaimer. And then make sure you're providing all relevant information on sick leave and FMLA. We're going to cover FMLA next week in more detail, but it is important to do that. And then predetermine your response for employees that aren't following a policy. Are you going to give a written, just kind of, I would even set up as an employer what that's going to look like in the future if there's issues with it. And then on the other side, there's volunteers, visitors, parents. The guidelines recommend signs at entrances, just reminding you of the basics. Those are the signs that you like so much. Waivers and disclaimers signed, and then obtain information in order to identify visitors later if applicable. That's another kind of, the state is really encouraging that. It's definitely, there's a lot of people that have an issue with that as far as the contact tracing, but I have had a couple of ministries that had a COVID positive case, and it was helpful for them to be able to reach out to everybody that was there that night and at least warn them, because some people are living with high-risk individuals in their homes. And I do think that can be helpful on some level.
So the waivers and disclaimers, we do have documents and forms. Go to the next slide. So we have forms and samples for both schools and churches.
Right.
And why don't you go ahead and start off? Let's address the schools first. What documents we have that are available?
We have documents for parents. We have documents for employees, obviously, within the staff. There's a few different. We even have form documents informing people that there has been a COVID-19 positive test that's just ready to go, and you just fill in the information and they can go out.
In regard to the church forms, or let me just talk generically about release and liability posters and forms having people sign. That seems to be what I've had the most questions about probably since the beginning of COVID-19 in churches and schools and ministries. Like, we want to operate. And what can we do to protect ourselves? Well, really, I mean, that's one of the things you can do. And that is to have them sign these forms, and you identify the risks of exposure. And
Sure.
And the other thing that's important is to address, just make sure you're not negligent. If you are callously indifferent to the risks, there could be a potential problem.
Right.
Okay, let's get to some of the questions that we might have here then. Let me pull open the YouTube.
We have two that came in prior. One of them, I believe we answered as far as, well, the question is, within schools, there's a requirement within the guidelines for teachers to be tested every 2 months, staff at the school on a rotating basis. And the question is this a requirement? Really, the answer to that is the same that it is for all the other guidelines. The state will say, yes, it's a requirement. In our experience, in order to get a waiver, you pretty much have to, in most counties, you have to say that you are going to do that. Really, what I've had an issue with is the testing as far as the financial side of it. And just so everybody knows, everybody listening, insurance companies are required to cover the cost of the testing. They're essential workers. Have your employees call the insurance company, whoever covers you, and say, hey, I'm an essential worker. I have to be covered by the state, and they should cover it for free.
One question or comment I think is worth pointing out. Carolyn Holt says, I live in Texas, but I'm listening because what happens in California tends to creep across the country.
Yeah.
We've seen that in so many ways in legislation. Being one of the most populous states, it's significant. What happens here often gets, as we've said, gets exported to the rest of the country. So I think you're exactly right, Carolyn. one question here: how does insurance come into these restrictions? We addressed that a little bit, but why don't you go ahead and briefly address insurance? Is it effective? Can we have insurance that is going to protect church, school, ministry when they operate?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly if you're abiding by the guidelines and you are abiding by the local and state public health orders, there are a lot of cases. I mean, that's a pretty broad question, but there are certainly a lot of circumstances where insurance should help if something were to happen. And really would encourage everybody to review their policies and talk to their brokers about it. Talk to your broker about when it does apply, when they're going to apply. Tender if you have any questions, meaning that you just submit whatever is happening to your your insurance company and see what they say.
And you can actually, if you have an issue, you can again contact us.
Yeah.
And if there is a potential liability issue, you can meet with us. Nowadays, so much is done through Zoom, so it doesn't matter where you are in the state or even the nation. We can meet with you, go over issues, and we often will be the ones tendering on behalf of your ministry to your insurance company. Sometimes that's important because we might be able to look at it from a different perspective and actually get coverage for you. Now, here's a question. We are a church in Purple County, in a Purple County that wants to meet indoors due to air quality. What is the liability risk and how can we lower the risk?
I don't know how to lower it, to be honest. I mean, there is liability risk. At the end of the day, you're violating the guidelines. If you do it for a week or two, are there going to be any ramifications of that? What we're seeing is probably not. I mean, there's an enforcement issue. They can't go around the state and start tagging every church. So if you limit the time frame, we have other churches either from heat or air quality that have gone inside for a week or two. If you're looking to minimize the liability and minimize the issues, obviously I think that it probably goes without saying, but social distance, use masks, follow the other guidelines. I would really look at the guidelines for the counties that are in the red, all the things that they have to follow if they are inside. If you're following those, that's really about all you can do.
I want to say that in California, I would venture to guess that there are easily a few hundred churches that are still meeting indoors. Regardless of the guidelines. And they're saying exactly that. You're telling us we can't meet unless we meet outdoors. Where the air quality is ridiculous. Funny thing is, I saw a meme last night from my nephew that he put out, and it was basically saying masks do not protect you from poor air quality with regard to the fires, the smoke, etc. Yet the COVID virus is a ton smaller than these, whatever particles that are coming out of the air from smoke. Anyways, it's just, I would say, ironic. Okay, another question from Stephanie. Please provide the name of that insurance provider. I'm not sure which specific insurance provider you were talking about. However, I definitely don't want to go on the record and identify an insurance company that you should choose or not choose, etc. I mean, there are various policies that some are better than others in different areas. Again, you really need to talk to your insurance broker. You can talk to us as well. We'll be happy to provide you some guidance with regard to insurance and what works and what might not work.
I think we're well over our time already.
Well, I think we're let's get to. I think we're almost done. One question or two left, and we'll be done. So hold on one sec. Here again, this is easy. Concerning schools, what about ministry schools, Bible colleges, small size? What are the guidelines? Are there any? Bible colleges, ministry schools.
The school guidance goes K through 12. Honestly, I haven't looked a lot into college guidelines because we just haven't had any clients that have popped up that are addressing that. The guidance that we referenced earlier definitely goes K through 12. So you'd have to look at the other guidelines and see what would apply to Bible colleges because I haven't looked at those specifically.
Yeah.
Colleges are in a different tier for sure.
Well, I think we answered just about all of the questions. So we'll conclude here. Please don't hesitate to contact us here at Advocates for Faith and Freedom and Tyler and Bursch. We'd love to help you if it is at all possible. Again, Advocates is a nonprofit organization where we take on religious liberty cases, whereas our law firm of Tyler and Bursch is this for-profit law firm where we serve as general counsel to churches and ministries all over the state. And our nonprofit side of the ministry is fully supported by donations. And the many cases we're taking on right now, it's tough, and we certainly appreciate donations that come in. Neither Jen or I get paid as lawyers to work on those cases through Advocates for Faith and Freedom, though we do have 3 full-time attorneys now working solely on the religious liberty cases, which is a big deal, and appreciate your support. Again, next Wednesday, the 23rd, we're going to have another seminar at 10 a.m., The New Landscape of Unemployment and FMLA, the Family Medical Leave Act. It's important for all ministries to understand this kind of new landscape with the unemployment laws and with COVID, what opportunities do employees, or what do you have to comply with when it comes to giving leave to employees for sicknesses. And then September 30th, we're going to talk about the pros and cons of state and federal funds for private schools, really for ministries, for churches, as it relates as well to particularly to the CARES Act that we recently saw, where the government provided the stimulus package. So we encourage you to come in, register, please, for our events at faith-freedom.com/events, and share this with anybody that you think this may be helpful to. So we will be sending forms, the forms and releases that we talked about. If you're not registered, you haven't given us your email address, we'll need that in order to know. So if you just came onto YouTube and are listening, but you've not registered, then we obviously don't have your information. So we won't be able to get those forms to you, but we'll provide those free of charge. Just register, get us your email address, your contact information. We'll send it off to you. With that, subscribe to our YouTube channel. And I guess, what do they say? Like us on Facebook. And stay up to date on what we're doing. So for our second Ministry Under Fire presentation, that's concluded. I think next week I have a hearing, so I probably won't be here. I think it'll be you and Netta doing the next presentation. So God bless you all, and please pray for our ministry and what we're doing. Thank you.
Thank you.